Hey guys, I wanted to make a follow-up video to the first video. This is why I hate critical race theory. And if you haven't watched it, just look up, I'll probably add a card there. But I wanted to expand and add new talking points to my thought process as to why I absolutely feel that we do not need critical race theory at all. The first thing I want to talk about is the roots of this sort of critical theory, or at least the historical perspective and the philosophical anchors from which these arguments arise. So the first thing is that postmodernism, at least we can start with postmodernism, is a foundation for the critical race theory framework. And Kimberly Crenshaw, in her journal essay Mapping the Margins, published in 1991, Stanford Law, did credit postmodernism as something to be sort of interwoven into the dynamic of critical theory and critical race theory. And of course, we have the Frankfurt School, which influenced critical race theory, which draws some of its precepts from Marxism or neo-Marxism, and Marxism draws a lot of its influence from Hegel and Hegelian philosophy, as well as Darwinism. I know Marx was kind of drawn into the whole evolutionary perspective. So through that whole school of thought up to postmodernism, you have a sort of argument for the existence of humanity that states that there is no absolute truth, and instead we have a sort of moral relativism dynamic, which means that there's no absolute truth. There's kind of like my truth, my lived experience, which is kind of the way it fleshes itself out in critical theory. And there's no inherent moral law that kind of comes from my nihilistic thinking or atheism, that there's no inherent law on earth. So killing and murder for one group might be fine, and for another group, because of their religious emphasis, would say that killing and murder is wrong. So that's what I'm talking about when I get to my last point in the first video about moral relativism, is that it's all about your truth and your experience and what your group deems to be the moral standard. Like it's all kind of human invented. Whereas my perspective, if you're going to tell everyone that critical race theory is a framework that must be adhered to, then you have to come from a framework that says that there is absolute truth, because then that would mean critical race theory is the reality of the world. But if you don't believe in absolute truth, then you are sort of operating in a philosophy that contradicts itself. And what I mean by that is that having critical race theory taught in schools, being emphasized as the way that the world just is. It's this group struggle dynamic between black and white, or if you're talking about queer theory, it's the group struggle dynamic between queer people and heterosexual people, etc., so on and so forth. So that was a bit of an expansion on my last point about moral relativism and the fact that critical race theory presents itself as a dogma. So that creates a hypocritical conflict, and that's a reason that I do not respect it and don't believe that we should be emphasizing it as the way that the world works. And so the first point I want to make in this new video is that critical race theory engages in a lot of mental gymnastics. For example, you're coming from postmodernism, which a lot of the people who began to critique the nature of things, the nature of the way the world exists, and the struggle of power, and the release of this sort of hegemonic dependence, I suppose, of like reason and logic and moral law. I mean, they ended up believing that they wanted to adjust the age of sexual consent so that they could literally have sex with underage people. It's like when you bend those laws of what's right and what's wrong because you want to construct the world in the way that you want it to be, you kind of end up in this moral muck and mire that is repulsive, and that's something I can't respect. I really can't respect people like Michel Foucault, because he was all about bending that dynamic, and even deconstructionism with Derrida and just breaking down language and saying that, oh, language was a construct by the people in power, and so we can't even rely on it, just makes people start operating on an uneven, like wonky ground. And there comes out of that a lot of mental gymnastics. So people will be like, there's no absolute truth, there's only my truth. And within that, they say that there are groups of oppressed and oppressor. But when once one person says within the oppressed group that they do not experience oppression, then there comes a statement of absolute truth, a truth claim that says that no, that means you're only just blind to your state of oppression. So there's a truth claim on my lived experience, which contradicts the fact that contradicts the whole notion of lived experience, but also walks back on the notion of absolute truth. So for me, I can't play those mental gymnastics. I would be all about critical race theory. In fact, I was all about critical race theory. You can watch this video right here and all my videos on my YouTube channel and tell me what you think. Do you really think that I just have been blind this whole time? Anyway, that's another point for another day. But I would be all about critical race theory if it wasn't for the mental gymnastics. And there's so many holes in their moral grounding and worldview. Another point I want to make is that there is no definite goal for equilibrium. For example, in the world of critical theory, in the lens of critical theory, you're fighting to dismantle the hegemonic dominant group. And you're calling their possession of power inherently bad. But you want to also assume the position of that power. So you're actually aspiring to something that you deem negative. But because in the moment you're looking at an oppressor group, you're like, oh, they're bad. And because they're inflicting oppression upon me, that just makes me righteous in my indignance, in my ferocity. And so you want to dismantle their power, but in that take over their power dynamics, take over the philosophy, the school of thought, the power over language. But then you're just assuming the thing that was bad, and in that you're going to create a new oppressed group as you dismantle the hegemonic tier. And I'm not defending racism at all. I'll get to that at the end, but I'm just talking about the philosophical gymnastics that makes it hard to understand why I need to believe critical race theory or why I need to use it. There's no definite evil. There's only, in the words of Voldemort, power in those who have it, or something to that extent. Anyway, so I leave that there. I'm not willing to play the mental gymnastics. If I state my truth and my lived experience, and then you make a truth claim against that because you're saying that this is the way the world is, you're just making it really hard for me to take this whole school of thought seriously. And I welcome any debate. If you have anything to say to that in contradiction, drop it down in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. But that's my one thing. And then from that, my second point, and this is probably going to wrap this video up, is that if you're coming from a school of thought that plays with subjectivism and moral relativism, then how can you be a sort of axis from which to gauge justice or social justice? Because justice is dependent on a law that exists out of yourself that you adhere to. It's not just that you write legal laws, but you write laws that you believe that everybody can adhere to. And so then you have the whole struggle for justice, because you believe that there is a just and fair way that everyone needs to be treated and everyone needs to go about in life. But that can't exist within nihilism. When it comes to sort of Marxist thinking, you're really removing, you're even allowing the fact that you can use violence to sort of overcome the oppressor. You're sort of bending morality to your own will. And so when you say that you're using critical race theory to fight for justice, and critical race theory in and of itself doesn't have any sort of axis or standard by which we obey and agree to, live civilly in an environment, then it can't really be the voice of justice, because justice is dependent on acknowledging that we all have a certain law written on our hearts. The scriptures in Romans says that we all have the law in our hearts that says, don't murder, don't steal, don't covet, don't lust after someone else's spouse, etc., etc. So I would rather use a biblical framework to understand justice, and in turn know that if someone has exceeded their debt, that they need forgiveness. And I think that's why we really need to talk about forgiveness, because it's not necessarily a fluffy term that you use for, you know, someone who stole your apple. It's like, really, I do believe that there is an invisible law within existence that you have bypassed, and it has done me wrong. But I understand in our equality that you can't bear that burden, and nor can I. So I will relieve you of that debt. Again, that might just have to be a video for another day. But ultimately, all in all, I just can't allow critical race theory to be the end-all, be-all hammer and gavel for justice. I mean, they don't really, people who look within a critical theory framework only just say there's sort of, you know, a struggle between powers, but when are we going to reach equilibrium? When is justice actually achieved? When are we going to stop creating classifications and divisions within groups and people? If it's not my meatloaf being ready, then it's a car alarm going off. But anyway, yeah, postmodernism or any sort of Hegelian, alchemical, philosophical school of thought that wants to remove itself from objectivism, reason, can't really be a proponent for justice because it just doesn't have a definite foundation. Now, I want to talk about the fact that, yes, there is racism. That was the final point that I wanted to leave off, is that we didn't need critical race theory to have the civil rights movement exist. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. didn't need Michel Foucault or Herbert Marcuse or Kimberly Crenshaw. Frederick Douglass didn't need Karl Marx in order to understand that slavery was wrong and that he wanted to be free and liberated. We don't need critical race theory for the elephants in the room. What we need is actual discourse and dialogue that respects people's backgrounds, respects people's philosophies, respect people's path and journey religiously. And we're able to agree that any sort of denigration of a human is absolutely wrong, and we do not want to endorse that. However, critical race theory makes room for us to associate whiteness or any other physical immutable trait with being bad and evil, still within its framework, contradicting itself constantly. And then we end up with this sort of genocidal end, unfortunately. But without critical race theory, we're not so much appealing to pathos. We're allowing there to be an appeal to pathos, appeal to logos, appeal to ethos, and we're allowing there to be a mixture of conversation and dialogue. We're not sort of possessing or owning the discussion on something and then having precepts and tenets about how to go about with that discussion. We're allowing there to be freedom of thought and freedom of expression, but within that, mutual respect for all groups and people, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, whatever it might be. I just think that we all know racism is wrong. I believe most people, just like Barclay said, I believe most people are good people. And we all ultimately want to get rid of racism. I don't think that we're ever going to get rid of any form of oppression ever, as long as we're humans and exist. And we all ultimately form ourselves back into a hierarchy. Like, even with communism, as we try to level the playing field for everyone, we always end up with absolutely egregious totalitarian rule. But we all know racism exists. And we don't need critical race theory to understand that. We don't need critical race theory to understand that there's a problem with representation in the media. If anything, critical race theory excuses Hollywood for the way that it represents black people, as long as it just brings in more representation, but it doesn't critique the nature of the representation, because it, again, doesn't really have a moral groundwork or framework. But anyway, these are just my thoughts. I'm about to cook dinner. Friends, this is why I hate critical race theory. Part 2. Let me know your comments, thoughts, responses, critiques, whatever. But like this video if you do like this video. And I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.